to give the microphone to Mr. Yon Fernandez de Larrinoa. And thank you for joining us as well, Yon. Yon is the team leader of the Food and Agriculture Organization's Indigenous Peoples team. Yon is an agricultural economist and has worked in the Policy Assistance Division, the Investment Center, and the Emergencies Division of the FAO, serving in Asia, Latin America, the Near East, and Africa. And from 2010 to 2014, he led the FAO Civil Society team, working to cement the reform of the World Committee of Food Security by enabling the participation of civil society in policy discussions. And in 2014, started leading the FAO Indigenous Peoples team to implement the 2010 FAO policy on Indigenous peoples. So Yon, why are land rights key to advancing climate, forest, sustainable development agendas? The agendas that both Nicole, Lucy, and I started talking about. And what is FAO doing to help advance the responsible governance of tenure of land and forests? And why is this important for Indigenous peoples? Would be great for the audience to learn more about FAO's voluntary guidelines on tenure and their contributions to policy-making processes in all of these multiple different arenas. Thank you, Yon.
Thank you so much, Evan, and thank you to the organizers for inviting us. I see you asked me three difficult questions, so I'll try to do my best. Technically, it's not that land rights are important for the SDGs. Indigenous peoples have rights, farmers have rights, pastoralists have rights. So it's not the land rights what is fundamental for the Sustainable Development Goals achievement. What it is fundamental is the respect and the recognition of those rights. The people have rights. This might not be recognized, this might not be respected, and that's what we have to work on. So it's different. We cannot alienate the individuals and the people from their rights because they are rights beings from the moment they are born. And this is very important in the human rights approach that we all follow. I'm going to try to cover the questions, but first I want to explain the relation between land and the respect of rights and food security, because I think this is important as a starting point. Now, FAO every year releases a state of food insecurity in the world. It's called SOFI, and it gives the number of food insecurity people that there are in the planet. Now, this past year, we had 850 million food insecure people. We have 155 million stunted children and 52 wasted. And 33% of women in reproductive age have anemia. Now, the malnutrition is combining stunting and wasting with obesity, which is a very interesting phenomena that is affecting all of us. But what is very important is that food insecurity has been decreasing in the past years. And indeed, in 2016, it was 777 million. So what we have seen last year is a reverse of the trends in the number of food insecure increasing. So it is unlikely that if we maintain this trend, that by 2030 we will meet the SDGs, particularly SDG 2, in relation to food insecurity and malnutrition. Now, why is this happening? Well, it's happening because the number of conflicts has risen, but more importantly, because they are compound with climate change. And there you see two very interesting things. The first one is that conflicts, the first thing that they do is they attack the respect and recognition of the rights of people, particularly vulnerable people, but also indigenous peoples, pastoralists, nomadic peoples, women, to their land rights. And the moment you attack those rights and the moment you do not recognize them, you start having food insecurity and famine. So these are direct and intrinsic relationship that if we don't understand, we will miss a lot of the picture. Then there are spillover effects. And one of the first ones is that the people resort to coping strategies that very often are dramatic and that they entail damaging the natural resources, exhausting the natural resources, and having a different approach towards the otherwise traditional management of the natural resources, because the people are in a situation of food insecurity. So first idea I want to put forward is the food insecurity or food security is directly linked to the recognition and respect of the people to their rights to land. At the same time, we need new and creative approaches to food, livelihoods, and tenure rights. I was very pleased when studying the New York Declaration on Forest. First, because it talks about 1.5 billion beings that live off forest and their livelihoods depend on forest. And sometimes we forget this amazing number of people that depend on forest. But something that really captured my attention, besides the multi-stakeholder approach on working with governments, regional governments, private sector, civil society, is the fact that you looked at the new procurement procedures. And I think this is very important. I still think that we need to rethink a number of issues that we don't give sufficient attention. The first one is the conceptual approaches that we have to forestry. We still filter particularly collective rights through the lens of productivity and production. We looked at forests, even the social forestry programs with, we have a group of indigenous people in a forest, let's help them out so they make productive use of their forest. And I think this, in many ways, if it is not managed carefully, it also contributes to deforestation. We need to understand that, but I think we also need new metrics and indicators. When we looked at most of the indicators we have to measure the use of forests, they are all related to quantity, they are all related to cubic meters, and more we need to come up with those indicators that are related not necessarily to ecosystem services, but to capacity to generate food, capacity to generate byproducts, capacity to generate livelihoods, capacity to generate micronutrients. And we don't have metrics for this as of today. We need to work on that. I think it's important when we talk about forestry, but not only fisheries as well, and pastoralists, to look at, to have a multi-pronged and multi-diverse approach that is rooted on territorial management. When we looked at indigenous peoples, one of the first idea that I think we learned is that indigenous food systems directly depend on the territorial management of the resources in a sustainable way. When those rights are not respected, the indigenous food systems tends to disappear, and with it, the natural resource base in which it is based. Now, at the same time, we need governance schemes. And we need, and it's very important, the accompanying tools. Not only the development, the self-determined development, but free, prior, and informed consent. If we all apply free, prior, and informed consent, first in our minds, because we don't want to practice it in our minds. No? We want to be subjects of free, prior, and informed consent, but we don't want to do it with the neighbor. And we don't want to do it with our projects because we don't have time, no, Grace, and we don't have money to, why are we going to ask indigenous women in Philippines about what they need? No, it's better to move on with the project. That is not going to take us anywhere. And I think Lucy said very well, I think the devil is on the details, and we have policies, we have frameworks, but we lacked implementation. And implementation very often does get stuck with details, and it gets stuck with how institutions operationalize the frameworks that we have. I think we don't have enough institutional understanding on the chain of command that governs ministries of forestry, ministries of agriculture. For us working in FAO, there's a very clear idea, is that most countries divide productive lands into the hands of the Ministry of Agriculture and non-productive or state lands in the hands of Ministry of Forestry. So you have two different paths that work with two different cosmogonies that sometimes we do not understand and that we all suffer. Let me go now a little bit to what FAO has been doing in forestry since you asked me. We've done a number of things. Since 2006, we've been doing assessment of forest tenure situation in the 4 regions in Africa, in South and Southeast Asia, Latin America, West and Central Asia, the Caucasus and the Russian Federation. And as a result of that, we put together a synthesis document on the reforming forest tenure in 2011. But I think a turning point for all of us was when the voluntary guidelines were approved. I don't know, can I ask how many of you have read the voluntary guidelines in the room? Okay, this is a problem. So you don't know this little book.
Be honest.
But then we have a serious problem, because it's like going camping and trying to light a fire with 2 stones and having a lighter and a matchbox in the pocket. No? Please read the document, because it's the first tenure document approved by members to govern the tenure in the world. And you shouldn't, or it's not appropriate to talk about collective rights, land rights, tenure rights, if you have not read it, because many of your countries have endorsed a voluntary document that, like UNDRIP, in many ways sets the rules of the game. So we cannot play the game if we don't understand the rules that our countries have accepted. Now, the voluntary guidelines was endorsed in 2012, and it followed, you know, every time we talked about land, it's long negotiations. It followed a process of 5 years. More than 700 people participated in the drafting, and there were regional and global consultations. But let me say, just give some figures on why it is important. It's been endorsed by 137 members, and it's a 10-year document that talks about land, forestry, and fisheries. It talks about UNDRIP and ILO 169, but it mentions indigenous peoples 45 times in the document. The longest section of the document is about the indigenous peoples. It mentions customary rights 34 times. It talks 96 times about forest. It talks 93 times about fisheries. And like I say, it mentions UNDRIP and ILO 169. So it is a well-crafted document. It is not perfect, but it has sets the rules of the games in terms of how we can manage a tenure of forestry, fisheries, and land. And it's very important because it tells the governments what the state of the art is, and it also tells the civil society, indigenous organizations, pastoralists, nomadic people, fisheries, women, what they can do. And many of the things that Lucy was mentioned are contemplated in the voluntary guidelines. One of them, for example, is that women have and must have the right to land recognized and acknowledged, and that the UN should work with governments to make sure that that is guaranteed. We have done many things on forestry. I'm pleased to introduce you a colleague from the forestry department. Is Marta Gruca, that is sitting over there. Marta, I don't know if you can raise your hand. She has come for the first time to the UN Permanent Forum because the forestry department is putting together an indigenous peoples plan and wants to really take up the work of indigenous peoples. As a matter of fact, in the Committee on World Food Security, which is the committee that approved the voluntary guidelines in 2012, last year they released an expert document on forestry and food security. So, to be provocative, I want to say that if you want to follow tenure, and if you are interested in collective rights, and if you're interested to land, the place to be is Rome, it's not New York. And if you're not following the discussions in the World Committee of Food Security, then you're not talking to the right actors that are actually negotiating land and tenure. So, thank you so much.